Hello. We are thrilled that this event is at maximum capacity and has representation from all over the world. Welcome. We are also joined by our live Facebook audiences. Hello to everybody joining us on Facebook. My name is Hazami Barmada, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Humanity Lab Foundation, an executive producer and host of the Finding Humanity podcast. And I am so honored to be your host today. We are gathered today on the eve of Nelson Mandela International Day, a day recognized by the United Nations and the world to honor the spirit, courage, and deep conviction for change of Nelson Mandela. This event is organized by the Elders, an organization founded by Nelson Mandela in 2007. The Elders are an independent group of global leaders working together for peace, justice, and human rights. Here is a short video about their inspiring mission.
In an age of populism and isolationism, when polarized politics and self-interest have the upper hand,
the Elders offer an alternative approach.
We believe that working together, humankind can overcome the shared problems we all face.
This importance of togetherness to show solidarity with those who are fighting for peace, justice, and human rights was an essential value of our founder, Nelson Mandela.
At a time when so many of our leaders are falling short or remaining silent in the face of wrongdoing, our mission as elders is to make sure Mandela's legacy lives on.
Madiba's vision is needed now more than ever. As elders, we don't claim to have all the answers, but we do believe that if the world can walk together,
talk together,
learn together, and speak out together,
we can shape a better future for us all.
Over the past months, I have had the privilege of interviewing members of the Elders as special guests on our new global affairs and social justice podcast, Finding Humanity. Through real-life stories of courage and purpose, Finding Humanity puts a human face on the most complex social and political issues facing our world. By bringing you voices from the front lines of war and injustice, Finding Humanity peels back the layers that surround today's biggest challenges and give people the inspiration to solve them. As part of our inaugural season, we produce special edition episodes with the Elders to add thought leadership, depth, and context to the topics that we covered throughout our first season, including poverty, gender inequality, ending war, human rights abuses, genocide, climate change, and much more. So in light of Mandela Day, we are inspired by the words of Mandela that give life to our podcast. And I quote, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It's inspiring others to move beyond it." To discuss this and more, I am so proud to be joined by my esteemed guests. Unfortunately, Gracia Michelle could not be with us today, but I am extremely delighted to be joined by Mary Robinson, Chair of the Elders, who is the first woman president of Ireland and former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Hello, Mary.
Hi.
And President Juan Manuel Santos, a member of the Elders, former president of Colombia, and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. So while this discussion will touch on issues surfaced in the Finding Humanity podcast, it is not about the podcast. So if you haven't heard it yet, don't worry, we hope you'll listen to it after this. But over the next hour, we're going to dive into issues that are at the forefront of many of your minds. For those of you who've submitted questions to us, we've kind of interwoven them throughout today. But for those who haven't, you can feel free to submit questions on the question and answer box in this webinar. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive right on in. So as we gather on the eve of Nelson Mandela's birthday, I'd like to ask you both, why do you believe that Nelson Mandela's legacy is still so relevant today? And President Santos, I'm going to go ahead and start with you.
Thank you. I think the legacy of Nelson Mandela today is more relevant because it's a matter of leadership. And what type of leadership did Mandela exercise is the type of leadership that we need now and that we are unfortunately lacking. It's a leadership based on some principles and some virtues that Mandela had. First of all, as you mentioned, courage. But courage has to be also connected with perseverance. And he persevered more than, I think, any other leader in recent history, 27 years in jail, and he persevered for his ideals. Sorry.
No worries. We're living in a world of COVID where phones ringing are the norm.
Not only perseverance, but also the compassion. He had a special way of looking at things and looking at his adversaries, understanding what their feelings were, and by that enabling some kind of common ground. And that was what Mandela also reached, a common ground that allowed South Africa to change and have peace. And that has to do also with the virtue that any leader, in my opinion, is the most important virtue of any leader: empathy, the capacity to put yourself in the shoes of others. So, I'm sorry. Are you hearing this?
We are.
I don't know. I turned on my phone. I don't know how to.
All right.
I'm so sorry.
You have to throw it out the window, Juan Manuel.
I turned on my phone. I don't know why. Anyway, technology today. I haven't been able to dominate.
You can't live with it. You can't live without it, huh?
Sorry. I'll try to continue then. Anyway, the virtues of Mandela and the type of leadership is what we need right now. And it's with this pandemic, you're seeing how necessary that type of leadership is needed. In this pandemic, the leadership that has really brought results is the type of leadership that Mandela exercised at this time, telling the truth, being having empathy, being compassionate, and especially persevering. And that is why I think Mandela today is more alive than ever.
And Mary, you worked pretty extensively with Nelson Mandela. Could you tell us a bit more also about why you believe his legacy is so relevant and so alive in all the work that we're all doing?
Well, Hazami, maybe I could just build on what Juan Manuel was saying and link it with the actual founding of the elders, because I was there at a planning meeting, first of all, in Ulisaba, which is a place Richard Branson has in South Africa. And we were sitting around a table, Kofi Annan, a number of the elders, and we heard singing. And that was because Mandela was arriving, and Grasa and Archbishop Tutu, who was our chair, went out to meet him, to bring him in. And he sat at the table with us. It was a round table. And he literally gave us our instructions. So he wasn't just keen to have a group of elders who would praise him for his leadership, although we obviously are incredibly impressed with that leadership, as Juan Manuel has so rightly said. He wanted us to bring hope where there was despair, to be independent, to work for peace and human rights. And he made that very clear. And he said nice things that are really very relevant. Like, when you go to a place, people in that place know more than you. So begin by listening. Very wise advice, not to come in with solutions from the outside, but actually to listen and then try and help from the inside. And then we had our launch on his birthday, the 18th of July, 2007 was his 89th birthday. And it was very emotional in many ways, because in the middle of it, Peter Gabriel, who'd been one of the two people, together with Richard Branson, who'd persuaded Mandela to form the Elders, Peter was asked to sing the song about Steve Biko, and he sang it beautifully. And poor old Archbishop Tutu lost his emotions for a moment. He just literally cried. And that was very important, because it meant we had the heart of what we were doing, as well as, you know, the mandate. It was very much heart and brain, you know, to try to somehow live and, in a humble way, fulfill what Nelson Mandela stands for in our world, which is, as Juan Manuel rightly said, is absolutely as relevant now as it was in 2007.
Yeah, and we touch on that issue in the podcast where we talk about empathetic leadership and the importance of listening, of caring, of compassion, of empathy. And it was interesting because in the podcast, it came up as whether that was masculine or feminine traits. Can a man be empathetic? And I think President Santos, your experience also has proven that yes, indeed, listening and empathy and compassion are traits that are that of a good leader, regardless and agnostic of any type of gender, racial, or ethnic identity. And I think that's the world that we need to move towards. So I'm going to go straight into the next question, which came from Facebook, from Andre. And he asked, if you think there could ever be a movement for peace following the United Nations Secretary General's recent call for a global ceasefire. A lot of our audience also sent questions and shared thoughts on social media about the need of promoting peace in the world. So President Santos, you speak a lot, and you spoke on the podcast a lot also about the challenges of peace building. So how can we create peace in the world today? Over to you, President Santos.
Well, it's very, very important to have the right attitude when you want to reconcile two adversaries. And there's a difference between a dialogue and going into a situation where you want to impose your own point of view. In dialogue, you go into a conversation or in a relation where you will accept the other person's way of thinking, even though it's completely different from yours. On the second path, you want to impose your way of thinking. So it's very, very important to create the necessary conditions for a peace process to be successful. And by that, you need to start persuading the people involved that they have to accept a transaction. They have to accept that there are other people that think differently. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to have peace. And I lived through that process myself, trying to create trust, trying to create that type of environment of accepting the other person's point of view. And when you reach that point, then starting to make agreements is much easier. Now, to answer the question directly of if the Secretary General's call to have a ceasefire, is that possible? My own experience and my point of view is every single conflict can be resolved. It can be resolved if you create the necessary conditions for it to be resolved. Each conflict has different conditions, but I am completely convinced that once you identify those conditions and work to create them, every conflict can be resolved.
And I think that's an extremely important point. And Mary, I'd love your perspective. We've spoken about this in the past in different parts of the world too, because so many times people say, oh, peace is possible there, but our circumstance is so much different. So Mary, what is your perspective? How can we achieve peace, given your very colorful experience in peacemaking and peace building?
Well, again, building on what Juan Manuel was saying, because I agree so much with him, there's a hidden strength in peacemaking, peace building, being brave about peace, and that is the role of women. Totally underestimated. I saw that in Northern Ireland. I saw the way women came out from the housing estates, Catholic women and Protestant women, out of the Republican and Loyalist closed off housing estates which never spoke to the other crowd. And they didn't want their young to be kneecapped and killed. They wanted them to have a future, and they came out bravely. I have seen the same thing over and over again. I've seen it in Africa, in Goma. It's the women who have tried, when I have my mandate as special envoy for the Great Lakes in Africa, I recognized that as a woman mediator, I needed to reach out to women and civil society in particular. And I was really impressed by what women were trying to do, but they didn't get the recognition. We tend to think of peacemaking. I know this is not what Juan Manuel thinks, but Santos thinks, but as two baddies coming together in a hotel with their allies and sort of getting cozy talks for a long time in trying to make peace. That's the image people have. And very often the real peacemaking on the ground is done by the women, resilient for their communities, desperately trying to, and sometimes the women, as in Liberia, surround the men. That happened in peacemaking in Liberia. They literally surrounded the hotel where the bad men were not making peace. And they said, we will not, we will no longer be your women. We will withdraw our services. You have to make peace. And they kind of absolutely forced them to it. It's wonderfully captured in Pray the Devil Back to Hell, the documentary by Abby Disney. I actually believe that we will make more peace and get more decision-making about peace if we will only include, as the Council Resolution, Security Council Resolution 1325 is marking its 20th anniversary this year. And it's all about women being at the table, particularly for peacekeeping, but at all the other tables as well.
Yeah, go ahead, President Santos.
Mary says is so true. In the Colombian peace process, this is the first peace process that was negotiated around the rights of the victims. According to the Rome Statute, we made the negotiation around the victims. Now, women played a very important role to the extent that there is a chapter in the agreement specially dedicated to women, a gender chapter, and they were the engine of the negotiation. And in that gender chapter, there is a special consideration for the women, because the more victims of the victims in a war are women. And if you recognize that and you give them and empower them in the negotiation will flow faster and easier. So I just wanted to add to what Mary just said, because I lived it in my own peace process.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important. And we're going to get into some of the other topics that people are asking. But a big part of what you're both talking about is also kind of interconnectivity of the various topics. You can't have peace without also thinking about the various aspects of how it impacts the community and gender. So Terry, who's joining us on our webinar audience today, hi Terry, notes that with so many problems facing the world, looking at COVID-19 and racism, injustice, and conflict, good leadership is often really lacking in the world. And I know, Mary, you touched on this in one of our episodes of the Finding Humanity podcast. So Terry asks whether you think the United Nations is still the right body to help address big global problems. Mary, your thoughts on that, please.
Yes, the United Nations is a key organization. We're marking its 75th anniversary. It is still the main organization at a global level, but the United Nations works through governments, it works through communities on the ground. I mean, I often think, since we became involved with your Finding Humanity, that one of the joys that I had as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was finding humanity on the ground in the most difficult circumstances. Going to Chechnya, in Grozny in Chechnya, a city destroyed, and seeing people coming out, an old man, a woman with a pram, to the sort of roundabout where there were stalls where they could get food and talking to them. And they were full of a courage of fight back, a courage of human rights defenders. So, you know, I think that's part of the answer I would give. The United Nations is the, if you like, it's the guardian of the norms and values, and they are wonderful. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have the Human Rights Covenants, with the Human Rights Treaties, but we also have the environmental treaties, etc. And I do take your point, which I'd like to re-emphasize, the importance of getting out of silos now and connecting these movements, if you like. There is a huge connection between all of these movements about equality. And it's a good time to do it, because I believe that COVID-19 is like a mirror to our world, because it's a mirror that has exacerbated all of these inequalities. And so it's great that you have a strong Black Lives Matter, that you know, it is linked now to the inequality of women, to the Me Too campaign, to and the more we can link them to the children wanting to strike for a safe future, to do with climate, that they say you're not responsible as adults at the moment because you're not providing us with a safe future. That's all actually connected, because it's all based on these values that the United Nations stands for. And so I don't see the United Nations standing apart. I see it as being at the center, yes, of a collaborative agreement of how we now implement. And the most recent manifestation of that is the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 and the Paris Climate Agreement. A great way forward for the whole world, because it says no country has been living sustainably with Mother Earth. We all have to change our ways. Now COVID has absolutely taught us that.
Apologies, and one of the things that we're seeing pop up on the Q&A over here is a lot of people asking about climate solutions. So Anthony, who's joining us on this live Q&A, is asking about how do we scale up climate crisis, solutions to the climate crisis, and build climate resilience. And I just want to tie that in here, because Evelyn, who also sent us an email earlier this week, asked whether we think COVID-19 has become a distraction from our capacity and ability, whether through the United Nations or independently, externally, corporations, individuals, from tackling things like the climate crisis, poverty, and other injustices. Have items or have pressing global issues taken a back seat currently? We're going to start with you, Mary, and then I'd love to go over to you, President Santos, because I know you're also a big fighter for climate justice and biodiversity. So Mary, we'll start with you on that one.
In many ways, I have an interesting response. I was very much kind of down and almost in despair, which is not allowed for an elder. We're not allowed to be despairing. We have to bring hope. But I wasn't feeling good in January of this year. We were starting this important 2020, and I was not seeing the ambition of governments to do what they needed to do to align their government policies, get out of fossil fuel much more quickly. And then COVID hit, and nobody would wish a COVID-19. It hit very suddenly, very starkly. It was a health crisis and an economic crisis, a political crisis. It is dire and terrible, but it has also caused us to reflect on a number of things, on the importance of government, on the importance of science, on the importance even of the collective behavior of people, because that's what's helping us to prevent the pandemic from being worse, because we are, you know, agreeing to lockdown, agreeing to social distancing. We're showing a kind of people power. All of these things seem to me to be more relevant to tackling the climate crisis, which hasn't gone away, which is still urgent. But what I think is we need to ensure in the recovery packages that governments are coming up with, and it's the rich world that has the money to come up with them. We also have to focus on developing countries in this context, but the recovery packages have to be aligned with the Green New Deal approach, with the biodiversity strategy approach that countries are more and more recognizing. All of this has to be seamless, if I could put it that way, linked together. So we deal with COVID and climate as two linked crises, and we have to move in the right direction on both. I think you're muted.
I sure am. The joys of technology. President Santos, would love your thoughts on that, specifically as it relates to how do you focus on really critical global issues like resolving conflict, like COVID-19, while also making space for longer term protracted issues like the climate crisis, which has been something we're trying to resolve for a long time. So how do you hold all those things and how do you prioritize?
Well, I would start by saying, and this relates to the last question, bodies like the United Nations are needed because we have nothing else. We have no alternative. And institutions like the United Nations are what the governments that are members of this institution want them to be. So, as Mary just said, governments, the importance of governments and the importance of science. I want to underline the importance of science, which is what shows us how to look to the future and also how to combine the future with the short-term problems and short-term interest. And by this pandemic, and I think this is one of the good consequences of the pandemic, is that the importance of science has grown exponentially. And you have seen how in every country, almost all the leaders are now saying, according to science, I'm going to do this or that. That was not present just a few months ago. And this is what is going to take us to more drastic solutions on climate change. Because unless we hear the voice of the scientists, that they say that this pandemic is nothing compared to the calamity that climate change is going to bring to the world. And when we are able to persuade the world that that is true because science says so, then governments will take the necessary action. So it's a matter of combining the short-term pandemic with the medium and long-term, or even short-term also, because we already have a big problem with climate change, but then connecting the two through science and persuading and forcing the governments to take more drastic action.
A point I'm delighted to make. Look how women leaders leading their governments have done well in comparison to their male counterparts. Look at Angela Merkel in Germany, the prime ministers of Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland in Europe, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, the president of Taiwan, and others. You know, they have taken tough decisions. They have listened to the science. They have brought their people with them in a trust that this is the way they have to go. And then they are able to come out earlier out of lockdown because they did the right thing. I'm very proud of the fact that women's leadership is showing up well at the moment.
Yeah, and I think there's an issue that's really interesting here, which ties into a little bit of what you're both saying. So we have Sahil, who's on this live webinar, asked in the Q&A box below around this idea of polarization of opinions. And when we're talking about making progress on any of these issues, yes, President Santos, we do have science, but there are still an array of people who do not believe in the not only the impact of science, but how authentic is it? We're living in a world where the term fake news gets thrown around all the time, and we're extremely polarized on topics. And also David from LinkedIn has asked us about the increasingly nationalistic and polarized views of countries and nations. And so both on a communal level, polarized opinions, but also on a country and governance level, how can we start to reconcile differences to create this collective movement towards solution-based thinking, which requires people from all sides? So I'm going to go ahead and start with you, President Santos. How do you reconcile different opinions?
Well, unfortunately, polarization is another pandemic that we're living in the world. And polarization feeds itself because it goes and feeds itself. And today with the social media, that process of radicalizing more is easier. So the solution for that is to be able to speak to the other side, to be able to communicate, because without communication, then polarization is increased. And so we need to make an effort to be able to sit down and speak about the problems, speak about the different points of view, and encourage that at all levels, in the schools, in the communities, in the cities, in the governments, and worldwide. If you don't sit down and try to solve the problems, speaking, communicating, then you will never have any common ground. You will never find any common ground, and the polarization will be worse and worse with time. So we need to try to make a big effort at all levels to bring people together and simply sit down and speak. And when you start speaking, you start realizing that the other person is not as bad as you thought, or that maybe we have common interest and we can start solving some of the problems that both see as a problem.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you're making, because again, it's the how do you hold both truths to be true? Because in order to reconcile, we have to acknowledge kind of progress, and how you make progress is by acknowledging mistake. And so on that topic, Mary, I'd love your opinion. How do we reconcile this polarized views? And I know in one of the podcast episodes that we did with you and Dr. Brundtland, we talked specifically about the importance of governments collaborating in light of things like COVID and war and refugee crisis that spill across borders. And you referenced Me Too. You referenced all these global movements, Black Lives Matter, where racial inequity has been plaguing our world for generations, where racial inequality has been plaguing so many communities and societies, whether it's based on gender or other types of ethnic divides. So we'd love your perspective on how do you start to bring these different communities together to realize we all need to progress together.
Maybe before I follow that point particularly, I just wanted to pick up on the idea of if you like, the climate deniers. You know, the earlier point about just not believing. I think COVID-19 has helped greatly there. We are going to see a stark evidence that governments that did the right thing, the tough decision, bringing your people with you, lockdown, then gradual phasing out, and getting back to being able to open up your economy, and the rich countries and the populous countries that have not done this well will be exposed very cruelly. So COVID has helped us with the science. Now back to your other point about the fact that business as usual was very unequal. Our world has been very unequal. We have not addressed issues that actually I had the privilege as High Commissioner for Human Rights of addressing very close to the end of my time as High Commissioner, namely the World Conference Against Racism. We were dealing with racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all of these issues, and we were getting resistance to issues of dealing with colonialization, dealing with reparations, dealing with some of the issues that are beginning to surface now. And I think in many ways, we're going to see a re-evaluation of what it is to be somebody. You know, if you take Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I'm sure I quoted it earlier, because I quote it all the time, Hazami. You know, it's a wonderful statement that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And dignity comes before rights. Dignity is who you are, essentially, your identity. If you're a trans person, if you're, all of those things, if you're Black and the police see you in a different way from a white person, all of that, and I think we're opening up space to really address those issues for the first time in a real way, which addresses, the inequities of, and the importance of things like apologies and the importance of gestures. It was very important when the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, came on a visit to my country, Ireland, and stood in the Garden of Remembrance and bowed her head. That made much more really good relations between Ireland and Britain, Britain and Ireland, than had been there previously. She actually helped with that single gesture. The King of Belgium has recently apologized for what his country was doing in the past in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We actually need to open up space for more realization that the hurts of the past still haunt us.
Yeah, and on that note, I know President Santos, I just want to touch on this really quickly since we already went into it a little bit earlier, but you talk in the podcast about sitting down and hearing from people who have lost, mothers who have lost their children in conflict, and actually absorbing and giving space for people to be acknowledged. So if you could just kind of maybe piggyback on that for just a minute or so, what importance do you think validation and acknowledgement have in achieving peace? That is a question someone asked about with how do you create the environment to listen? So if you could just touch on that quickly, please.
Yes, I mean, you can go at the top, and there's an example that I use a lot, is when in the middle of the Cold War, Reagan and Gorbachev sat down, and Reagan said to Gorbachev, I will never become a communist, and you will never become a capitalist, but let's work together for a superior objective, which is bring down the nuclear arsenals. That I applied with my neighbor Chavez when he then came in and helped me in the peace process. And this is very important. Now, when you go down at the grassroots and hear the people who are suffering the war, who are suffering the injustice, you immediately create an empathy, which is absolutely necessary to be able to lead the way towards a solution or towards peace. So by hearing the victims, in my case, I was re-energized to persevere. This is something that Mandela always said, you must persevere, you must not throw in the towel. And by hearing the victims, I was re-energized because they themselves, which I thought were going to be very reluctant for me to give any kind of concession to the adversary because of the atrocities that they had committed, I was very surprised that they were the most enthusiastic. And they told me, President, you must continue. And I said, why are you so generous? Why are you being so constructive? And they said, because I don't want other people to suffer what I have suffered. So hearing the victims and giving them a voice in any conflict is extremely, extremely important.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Mary, I'm gonna go over to you. We have a question from Rosemary, who's joining us from Jamaica. So hi, Rosemary. And she's asking about Madiba's leadership paradigm, saying that in essence it's a non-Western paradigm. And with all the awareness that's currently coming out of Black Lives Matter and us listening to what's happening around the world with people being able to step into their authentic leadership styles, that may not be this idea of a Western leadership model as Rosemary refers to it as, how can our leadership and world leaders specifically start thinking about different leadership models that actually allow us to maybe infuse some traditional, maybe not what we would envision and expect in the traditional kind of sense of what leadership means. So can you help us dismantle that a little bit? Thank you, Rosemary, for that important question. So Mary, over to you.
Thank you, Rosemary. That is a really important question, and one worth spending a little bit of time probing. First of all, take Nelson Mandela's leadership. That was based on having been incarcerated for so long and forgiving his captors and coming out with that whole sense of Ubuntu. And I remember we had a discussion about that as elders, and some of us asked Archbishop Tutu, who was our first chair, tell us, what does Ubuntu mean to you? And he said, it's very simple. I am because you are. I am because you are. It's that dignity of recognizing the dignity of the other in a full sense. And so that's one important thing that the elders, we try to give a leadership that is not Western. It's taking the values of Mandela and Ubuntu and trying to, link that. Another way I would look at this is the importance of women's leadership. I'm a great believer that the feminist leadership has brought great strengths to how we should lead. The strengths of leadership being about service, about problem solving, about collaboration, about much less ego. And I want to make it clear, to me, Juan Manuel is this kind of leader. It's not whether you're a man or a woman, but the feminist tradition of leadership has shown that there is a different way of leading, and that it actually is a way that listens. And when I meet women leaders, when we meet together in a private group, and I do this quite a lot, needless to say, as a former president, we actually often, express our concerns that we didn't do so well on such an issue, that we should have really done X or Y, that I wish I'd done better on that. I've never heard male leaders, when they come together, be able to talk about their doubts and their, the concerns in that kind of way. And it's a great strength. It's a great strength to have doubts about your leadership so that you can lead better.
Absolutely, and you are seeing it today. There are two types of leadership. What I call the vertical leadership. It's the one that you give orders. You are the authority. You know everything. Usually, it's the type of leadership that is used during war. But making peace needs a completely different type of leadership, a horizontal leadership. You don't give orders, you persuade, you convince. To convince somebody to forgive the perpetrators, that needs a special type of leadership. And that's what women today in the world, the women who are leading the countries that are being successful in the pandemic, are using. They're using this horizontal, persuasive type of leadership versus the type of leadership that Mr. Trump or Mr. Bolsonaro or Mr. Lopez Obrador in Mexico are using, and they are failing because that type of leadership today is obsolete and doesn't work. So women are showing a much more effective leadership in today's world because they're, first of all, they're being much more, they are saying the truth, what Angela Merkel did when she got the news about the pandemic. The first thing she said to the Germans, 70% of you will be infected, and we start from there. Others try to underplay the problem, and you can see the difference in the results.
Yeah, and on that, we have a question from Asra. And Asra is asking, I mean, it's easy to talk about women needing to step into leadership positions, but how do we support women actually doing that? And Asra is speaking specifically about how do you build gender equity in a world and facilitate enabling women leadership. Mary, I know you spent quite a bit of your career creating that space. I'm gonna go ahead and go over to you for that one, please.
Well, you know, I do agree that women have more barriers to being successful in decision-making areas, for example, politics or at the top level of business, the boardroom of business, etc. And we know that, and we have the inequality of pay, all of those issues. And we have an inequality often in the home of who has responsibility for the child minding, for the household duties, etc. All of those things. But I'm seeing more and more women's networks, and they're young women, and they're women of color, and they're you know, the children in the you know, if you look at the climate marches, you know, it's not just Greta Thunberg. There are thousands of young women Gretas. It's wrong to call them Gretas, actually, because that you know, it's unfair to them. And actually, there's a nice blog on the website of the elders from a really good, wonderful young climate activist in the United States of why she is not Greta Thunberg. She's a Mexican who came to the United States, Shea, and she tells her story very well. But at the same time, young women are coming forward in a way that didn't happen before. And I think we've broken a certain cycle, not broken completely, but we're all sort of aware that a young man feels he's perfectly capable of taking on anything because everything in his culture tells him, be assertive, be strong, be courageous, go for it. And a woman is told, you know, boys won't like you if you're too assertive. You know, all the words are pejorative when they're applied to a young woman. And this has been there for so long. But I think we're breaking it. I can see, I have great faith in young women. I think they're coming through, despite all those barriers that I talked about.
And I really love that. And I'm going to go over to you, President Santos, because I do think that while it is so critical that we also talk about empowering young women, it's also really critical that we teach young boys and young men how to be more empathetic, how to harness emotion in leadership, how to listen, how to challenge the assumptions of masculine leadership traits, or as Rosemary put it, kind of this new way of thinking about how can we reinvent leadership. So President Santos, a lot of people have been asking about young people and what can we do to enable young people to play a meaningful role. In our podcast, we talked to Victor Ochin, who was a young peace builder, and part of his story, he told us that people didn't take him seriously initially. So you have a lot of experience with also inspiring the next gen. You're very active on social media also. So how can young people play a role and be taken seriously in that role?
Well, first of all, as everybody knows, education plays a very important role. And the type of education you give to the young boys and girls is critical to how afterwards this society is going to behave. The example of young people that they are open to ideas for the rest of the world is also very important. We had the experience of getting the sons and daughters of the guerrillas and the sons and daughters of the paramilitaries that were killing at each other, and we brought them together, and they started realizing that they could live with their adversaries, and they could play football together, they could play games together. And when you show that to other communities, that has a very powerful message. I very much believe in what the economists call the demonstration effect. And talking about how to empower women, the best way to empower women for leadership is to show the success cases that we are seeing today in today's world: New Zealand, Norway, Finland, Germany, Taiwan. These are women leaders that are having success. And that has a very, very powerful message, and it's a very powerful way to empower women or young kids.
Yes, thank you for that. Very, very, very important. And I know we are getting flooded with questions. There are so many questions, and I deeply and sincerely apologize that we will not be able to get to all of them because we're kind of dwindling down on time, but please do keep the conversations going. We are eager to keep engaging in these conversations with you. But I am going to ask a question now on human rights, because this is an issue that comes up quite a bit, which is how do we ensure, and this question came from Michael, how do we ensure that human rights law ends up as human rights practice? And again, the difference between policy in theory and application of policy and law. So we speak a lot about human rights, but we don't really speak about human rights responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that human rights are protected? And how can we do better collectively as governments, as people, as organizations, and as societies? Mary, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Okay, well, obviously I like that question, and I could answer at great length, but I won't. I'll try and synthesize some ideas. First of all, governments have the primary responsibility to protect the human rights of their people. And they have signed up to covenants and treaties. They sign them, they can be held accountable. And the whole human rights approach is to hold governments accountable for what they have agreed they will do. And you know, when I served as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I had more other countries helping me in that work than happens now with the current High Commissioner. Somehow countries are abdicating from a responsibility to hold governments to account for the human rights that they have agreed to. A second huge development that took place was the responsibility of business. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights, unfortunately, they're still only guiding principles, but there's a move to make them treaty-based. Again, you know, more obligations, is less than governments. The governments have an obligation to protect, but every corporation in the world now is under the guiding principles supposed to respect all human rights. And if you respect something, you must know what you are doing in your corporation, what you're doing in your supply chain, whether you are, in fact, having a due diligence approach that respects human rights. And so this is a debate that's going on. And it's kind of coinciding with an interesting debate that I'm seeing in the corporate world, in parts of the corporate world, which is kind of encouraging, that we need a new social contract in our world because of all the inequalities. And that social contract has to be based not on shareholders being the only concern about making money for your shareholders, which has been a large part of it, to a stakeholder approach, that you should be supporting the workers and the communities affected by what the corporation does. And that's all linked to also commitments on environment, etc. So it's a very important time, but I actually I'm concerned that, you know, when I would go as High Commissioner to very difficult situations, because that was my job, all over the world, I would meet the bravest human rights defenders. And those human rights defenders in Latin America, which I'm sure Juan Manuel could speak to more eloquently than me, are defending the land and water rights of their people. And so many get killed or, you know, really badly treated. And they're so brave. We need to take a kind of inspiration from the way that people look at Hong Kong, where they're being deprived of some of their human rights, how desperately those young people want those human rights, and rightly so, and how we're not really defending those human rights adequately in our world today. We need to reimagine a world which is one where all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and those rights have to be respected by those in power.
Yeah, and I really love that very inspiring way to really think about a new social contract, but also the responsibility that we each play in creating it, being active participants in it. So, President Santos, what gives you hope? If you can give me a very quick, I know it's really hard to answer this in a minute, but what gives you hope for a better future?
Quoting Mary, when she speaks about hope, she brings a sentence of one of the founders of the elders. I am a prisoner of hope. And I think we are all prisoners of hope. One of the great leaders who said that hope should always be present in our hearts and in our souls was Mandela. And with hope, you can do many things. Without hope, you are lost. So I am hopeful that everybody has the capacity to understand the power of hope and never lose it. And with hope, you can always bring change.
And that's an extremely beautiful, an uplifting thing. And we really hope that you leave here today inspired with a renewed commitment for action. If there's anything that COVID has reminded us, it's that our lives are interconnected and that people are interdependent. And to quote Madiba, and I quote, for to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. And as part of our commitment to inspire change, we hope that through the podcast, we can contribute to the wave of activism that is demanding justice, peace, civility, and human dignity for all. So with that, I'm going to go over and share a quick clip of some of the highlights of the Elder episodes from the podcast.
The archetype of how good is qualified is if you care for everyone. You defend the rights of everyone.
You must be close to the suffering that war produces to really understand why it's so terrible.
Women try to lead by example. They set the pace. They get it done.
You also need strong governments that can be strong enough to work with others and to protect their own people at the same time.
We haven't lost our instinct for human rights. The question is, how do we build back better?
This is Finding Humanity, a new podcast from the Humanity Lab Foundation and Human Group Media. Our inaugural season is made possible in part by our collaborating partner, the Elders. Through our podcast, we hope to educate and inspire you to take action, and together, create a better world for all of us.
Finding Humanity podcast is produced by the Humanity Lab Foundation and Human Group Media in collaboration with the Elders. And you can visit findinghumanitypodcast.com to listen to all the episodes. And I want to take this moment to thank Mary and President Santos for this very thought-provoking and inspiring discussion. And Mary, I want to give you the last word. If you can just kick us off with some final thoughts on how we can go forth and make this world a more just and beautiful place.
I think I'll just go back to another sentence of Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it is done. And, you know, to be brave, to be courageous, to understand the values that make us more human together and link us in so many different ways. And I have great hope for young people in our world today. They know that it is possible and it is not impossible and it will be done.
That is unbelievably beautiful. And I will leave you with one final thought that inspires me so much, which is Mandela's quote from his acceptance speech from the Nobel Peace Prize, where he says, "Let it never be said by future generations that indifference, cynicism, or selfishness made us fail to live up to the ideals of humanism. Let a new age dawn." And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you both for contributing your time and your thoughts and your wisdom and your heart. All the best, everybody. Thank you so much.